I'm on my way to Parliament Square. Probably going to be a damn squid, but we'll see. I hope it will be. I have to admit to feeling somewhat apprehensive, but we'll see. My dog, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most delightful creatures I've ever encountered. Many of us feel that way about our dogs, and it's easy to see why. She is always delighted to see me. I always get a ridiculously exaggerated welcome. The kind of welcome that is usually reserved for long lost friends and family in the human world. And I get that every day. It's undeserved, but still I get it. And it is the most wonderful thing. This is the reason I think that we have dogs. They flatter us and make us feel that we are the most important person in the world. But they also do something that we are mostly incapable of doing. They live utterly in the moment. When I come through the door, she is totally happy to see me. She doesn't compare her happiness to how she felt yesterday or how she's going to feel tomorrow. She is completely uncomplicated and completely joyful. Maybe that's why we called her Joy. But we're not like that. Unlike our dogs, it's our memories that make us what we are. Our memories are as important to us as the nutrition that we put into our bodies. Well, maybe not quite as important, since when push comes to shove, most of us will prioritise our survival over everything else. That's most of us. But there are times when a human being's impulse for self-preservation is overridden by something else. There are times when human beings deliberately put themselves in mortal danger, when the sensible thing would be to turn and run. These times can be at any time. They can be when someone throws themselves into the path of a speeding car to save a child in the road. They can be when a lone man comes to the aid of another who is being beaten by a mob. These times can happen at any time, but mostly they come in times of war. And we revere that. We revere it because we know instinctively how hard that must be to do. We revere it because we can never be sure that we would be able to do it ourselves. We revere it because we wonder whether we would stand and fight, or whether we would instead turn and run. And because the idea of self-sacrifice for a flag, for a nation, for an idea is so noble, we struggle to find ways in which to honour and commemorate it. In our modern commercial world, most of us are rewarded, to a greater or lesser degree, with money for our efforts. And that's fine. Money is as good a reason as most for doing things. But to reward those who have made the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice for others that they will not benefit from personally, the reward of money is not only impractical, because they're dead, but it's also a bit grubby. So instead of giving them money, which we cannot, we build them memorials. We build statues. We build statues that attempt to elevate them above the rest of us, which is how we feel about them. We feel that they are heroic, so we portray them heroically. We commission sculptors to visualise them, and poets to add words that move our souls. The glorious dead. For your tomorrow, we gave our today. And at the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. And because we cannot give them money, although we can and should give it to their families, we attempt to give them time, our time. Not much time, admittedly, but the time that we do give them remains mostly sacrosanct. 2 minutes. 2 minutes every year at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. 120 seconds to attempt to put ourselves in their shoes, to imagine the fear that they were feeling as they stared death in the face. 120 seconds for us to contemplate whether we might, in our stupid little lives, actually be worthy of them. And so this is a big deal. It's a big deal when the 2-minute silence is not observed. It's also a big deal to wear a poppy. Although, like many things, the custom can be hijacked by bad faith actors. Politicians and journalists, as usual, are some of the worst offenders. Photojournalists prowl hypocritically with their cameras, hoping to catch some public figure disrespecting our heroes by catching them without a poppy. Politicians have responded with the unedifying trick of competitive poppy wearing by signalling their enhanced reverence by wearing a poppy from mid-October. I care more about our heroes more than you because I've been wearing a poppy for longer than you. This holier-than-thou trick is totally transparent. The Royal British Legion used to suggest that a poppy should be worn from November the 1st until the 11th, or until Remembrance Sunday, if that was later. Then it should be removed. The brevity of its display adds to its poignancy. So these things are important to us. They're particularly important to us as British people. And the various monuments and memorials are our collective national memories. The most holy of all these, of course, is the cenotaph on Whitehall, just outside Downing Street. As a Scouse serviceman I met on Saturday was telling me, the cenotaph is a war grave. There is a body, an unknown soldier under there. And because it is an unknown soldier and is connected with no particular person, it is apolitical. And because it is apolitical, it is the sacrifice itself, rather than the particular war or campaign, that can be remembered and honoured. Left wing or right wing, rich or poor, black or white, or any other characteristic is immaterial. And it is consequently an extremely big deal if it is ignored, dismissed or disrespected. Like when Michael Foot was pilloried for showing up on Remembrance Sunday in a scruffy bomber jacket. And it's a really big deal when it is attacked by someone attempting to set fire to the Union flag attached to it. And it's about as big a deal as it's possible to be when the police not only witness this desecration, but rather than do something about it and enforce the law and prevent criminal damage like they are employed to do, instead decide to genuflect before the baying mob. Big deals don't come any bigger than that. And so what's the result of that? What do the powers that be expect is going to happen after that? What do they expect when the great bulk of the population has been so insulted? Do they expect peaceful protests? Do they expect dignified vigils? Or do they expect all those rough, tough, working class men and ex-servicemen and veterans to pen a stiff letter to their MPs? So despite the fact that the supposedly largely peaceful Black Lives Matter protests of the previous weekend resulted not only in the desecration of the cenotaph, the injury of 27 police officers, but the crass and infantile accusation of racists scrawled on the plinth of the statue of a certain Prime Minister of 80 years ago. And so we come to Churchill. Churchill was born in 1874 to Lord Randolph Churchill and his American wife in Blenheim Palace, perhaps the largest residence in the richest and most powerful country in the world at the peak of its imperial power. I think it's safe to say that he was born with a fair amount of material privilege. But his privilege was far from absolute, receiving at the crucial and hyper-impressionable age of 17 a damning letter from his father detailing his utter uselessness and his fatherly shame that he, Winston, would never amount to anything. It was a letter that would have felled the confidence of even the most arrogant of young men. But despite this, he rose to become the greatest of all Britons, bar none. His foresight, toughness, determination, principle, and his ability to rouse the British people to overcome what many believed at the time was certain defeat by a much stronger enemy is why we love him. And we do love him. Was he a racist? By today's standards, almost certainly so. But he was raised at the top of a society that was, at the time, the world's most successful in terms of power. He was an imperialist. Of course, by today's standards, he was a racist. You couldn't be an imperialist without being racist. You couldn't have an empire unless you thought that you were superior to those you had colonised. Quite literally, it came with the territory. That sense of superiority was what built the empire. And it was that sense of superiority that had to be educated out of us in order for the colonies to become sovereign nations in their own right. Do today's woke warriors condemn him for being a man of his time, as they are not also people of their own time? He would have absorbed the things he was taught, just as all the pathetic social science graduates today absorb bollocks like critical race theory. Today's wokerati are not, by any stretch of the imagination, original thinkers. But somehow they expect Winston Churchill to have magically transcended his own time in order to have had opinions that were more acceptable to people in 2020. He was a great man, perhaps the greatest that ever lived, but he wasn't perfect. Do people seriously think that if he was a 1940s version of Justin Trudeau, he could have beaten Hitler? No. Despite what they've all been saying, they don't think he was a racist. Not really. That's the excuse. They're attacking him for one reason, and for one reason only. He is the single most revered person in this country. And so he has to be taken down. Obviously. Because this is proof, if further proof were needed, that our history, our culture, our very sense of ourselves must be destroyed. The soul of the nation must be extinguished, so that only the institutions remain. Only the power remains. Power for its own sake. Power as an end in itself. And so we, the great unwashed, have a problem with this. It is ironic that the supposedly cultured metropolitan types are so neglectful of our culture. But of course, British culture is the wrong culture. In their eyes, it is not even culture at all. To them, it is even anti-culture. To them, we smell of pubs and wormwood scrubs and too many right-wing meetings. Now, as I say, I was somewhat apprehensive about going to London last Saturday. I wasn't sure what to expect. Many people discouraged me from going, saying that we were walking into a trap. Some even called it a honey trap, which is a strange analogy since even a honey trap has honey in it. So it might have been more prudent to stay at home, and there was not much that I could do about things myself. But then if I and thousands of others hadn't gone, it would have meant that we were conceding ground. For prudence's sake, of course. But it would mean that the statues were then unprotected. And that couldn't be allowed to pass unchallenged. In the event, due to a massive police presence, a presence much, much greater than the previous weekend, we were kept well away from the Black Lives Matter gathering at the other end of Whitehall in Trafalgar Square. Now, part of my apprehension was because of what might happen. The far right would be there, I was told. Racist thugs would be there, I was warned. Were there people there who were determined to cause trouble? Well, that depends on how you define trouble, and at what point do you consider the start of the trouble. There were certainly people there who weren't afraid of violence. There was a lot of booze, and there were a lot of proper hard nuts. Some were pissed, and some were pretty scary. I was even threatened by someone who was suspicious of my camera. So some of these guys weren't the most attractive of characters, if I'm brutally honest. So did I respect them? Well, I didn't disrespect them, which is what most of the rest of society and the media have been doing. They were angry, and I don't blame them. Were they causing trouble? No. They were responding to trouble. The trouble was at the Black Lives Matter march. The trouble was a fashionable cause that was able to behave in an anarchic and fascistic manner, and the police, instead of being the police, just went down on bended knee and gave a green light to poor behaviour and vandalism. Even if you didn't agree with protecting the statues and the cenotaph and thought it an invalid protest, can you really blame these guys for wanting to make an impact at least as challenging as those who would tear down our culture? Even if it was a revenge riot. The other reason I was anxious about going was that I knew how our side would be portrayed. Sure enough, our glorious media misrepresented and focused on the short and intense bouts of shouting and screaming and chucking bottles at the riot gear clad coppers, as well as the odd crowd barrier. It was nasty, and it was, I'll admit, quite ugly. But I never heard a racist word uttered. Some may find that hard to believe. And again, I'll concede there were perhaps only half a dozen black people there. But from what I saw, they were made to feel particularly welcome. There were football-like England chants, which involved raising your hands in the air. Gary Lineker, who of all people should know about football chants, attempted to imply that the raised arms were Nazi salutes. This is the left's pathetic attempt to claim the moral high ground by suggesting that give these guys the tiniest excuse and they'll all be queuing up to shove Jews in the gas chambers. But these blokes hate the Nazis. They, like me, were there to celebrate our society's victory over the Nazis. Because that was, in the great man's words, our finest hour. And we hold on to that as a towering example of our liberal, tolerant and inclusive society over something quite dark and perverted. They may not say it very eloquently, but they say it. They say it loud and clear. But the double standards are part of life when dealing with the media and the judiciary. The guy who almost certainly inadvertently relieved himself next to the memorial to PC Keith Palmer, the policeman killed by jihadi terrorists a few years back, was sent to jail for 14 days. Maybe that's a fair punishment. Maybe it isn't. But I don't recall the bloke who tried to burn the flags at the cenotaph being detained, arrested, charged or convicted, despite there being ample high quality video evidence of his identity. Like I say, the cenotaph is a war grave. Keith Palmer's memorial is the equivalent for the police force. Funny how drunkenly and absent-mindedly pissing on a copper's memorial demands almost summary justice for that fella, whereas deliberately and with malice desecrating the memorial that collectively symbolises all of our war dead, from the Napoleonic Wars to the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, is given a free pass. Why? Because racism. It seems you can do anything you want if you just say, because racism. But having filmed and broadcast the worst of the behaviour, the media weren't interested in what I witnessed earlier in the day. The police had made a line of riot police separating the bulk of the crowd from the cenotaph. They would have said it was to protect it, but there was not a single person on our side of the line would have dared touch it, or would have wanted to. Remember, the whole reason we were there at all was to protect the monuments, because we knew we couldn't rely on the police and the authorities to do it. But nevertheless, in a largely empty Whitehall, there was this old fella. He must have been in his 70s, maybe his 80s, and he was trying to challenge the police over what they were doing. He was asking them why they were not being impartial, and that why they were giving in to one side and not the other. But far from being at all abusive or even belligerent, as the football lads were later, you could tell that this chap was just crestfallen. It was heartbreaking to watch, seeing him quietly and earnestly protesting this fascistic paramilitary force in the heart of what I imagined was his beloved country. The press, of course, weren't interested in such an exchange. Luckily for you, I was.
Now's a perfect time to take the knee, you lot. Now's a perfect time.
Not to be partial for Black Lives Matter, to be independent. That's what policing is all about. Why are you
You get back. You get back. You get back. You get back. Leave him alone. You leave him alone.
Stop it!
Come on, mate. Stop him.
We're not. You're just being like you're like the Nazis.
Yeah. Do your job. Do your job. You know you're not. Take the knee. Come on, take the knee.
Why don't you
take the knee to us?
Do I look like somebody who's going to hit you? All we're doing is asking to move back, sir, that's it.
We're
right to
free
protest,
citizens. Thank you. We're free citizens.
But you need to do it in Parliament Square. So can you please move back towards Parliament Square?
You're more than welcome to assemble, but there is a place, a section 14 of place.
Why not there? Well, we're going to do it in front of Churchill, are we? We can't see him because he's been boarded up.
Aren't you ashamed of yourselves?
You need to move towards Parliament Square. Thank you. I appreciate your cooperation. Thank you.
I don't know, that's my body wants to call in.
Did you ever think you'd see the day?
No, I didn't. It's absolutely appalling.
Yeah.
taxpayers' money, pay for your salaries, and all you're doing is turning on your own people, turning on people who love their country. You should be ashamed of yourselves.
It's a travesty, isn't it?
It is.